Hey guys, my name is Joseph Brendan. In this course, I will teach you how to use material design as a UI UX designer. But before we get started, I would like to mention that this course is not for absolute beginners. To take this course, you need to have an average experience in UI UX design. Nevertheless, if you are new to UI UX design, I have a link to my 10-hour design course in the description. Go ahead, watch that, then come back here and watch this. So let's see what we are going to learn in this course. First things first, we are going to provide an answer to an important question, which is, what is a UI UX design language? When we provide an answer to this question, the next thing we are going to do is to get introduced to material design, to know what material design is. Now, when we know what material design is, the next thing will be for us to learn about design tokens. Then, when we understand what design tokens are, the next thing will be for us to understand what material design tokens are. And when we understand what material design tokens are, we are going to learn how to create a typography system using material design. When we learn how to create a typography system using material design, we are going to see how to create a color system using material design. Now, after we create a color system using material design, we are going to create a responsive grid system and a shadow system using material design. And finally, we are going to see how to use material design to create components. So this list is an overview of all we are going to cover in this course. Now, without wasting time, what is a UI UX design language? So, a UI UX design language is a set of UI UX design guidelines and principles that is put together by any design entity for UI UX designers to use when designing the user interface and the user experience of websites and mobile apps. As simple as that. So, now that we know what a UI UX design language is, let's move ahead to the next item on our agenda, which is to get introduced to material design and getting to know what material design is. So, material design itself is a UI UX design language that was created by Google in 2014 for the sole purpose of improving and optimizing the designing of user interface and user experience for websites and mobile apps. Now, in a nutshell, material design contains design principles and design guidelines that were put together by Google so that other UI UX designers around the world can have a universal design standard to use when they want to design user-friendly products. So now that we understand what material design is, it is time for us to move ahead to the next item on our agenda, which is design tokens. Now, to properly understand what a design token is, it is important for us to start with understanding the overall development process of an application. Because when we understand the process it takes to fully come up with an application, there we will understand the role design tokens play in the picture. So, when an application is about to be developed, the UX research team will carry out the UX study and then come up with recommendations that will be approved and then handed over to the UI design team, right? And when the design team is ready, the design team will hand over their style library and their designs to the software engineering team, right? Fine. Now, to understand design tokens, let's focus on this connection here between the design team and the engineering team. So, this connection here signifies that the application is leaving the design stage to the engineering stage. Now, when an application is leaving the design stage to the engineering stage, how does it leave? Of course, we know that for the application to leave the design stage to the engineering stage, the UI UX designers will have to send the designed screens of the application, the component library of the application, and the style library of the application to the engineers. Now, among all of these data that is to be sent to the engineering team, the style library is the most important. And that's because the component library and the designed screens of the application were all designed with the values of the styles in the style library. Now, the question is, as a UI UX designer, how do you send your style library to the engineering team without violating agile standards? Now, the answer to that question lies in your understanding of design tokens. So, what is a design token? Now, a design token is a piece of data that UI UX designers create so that they can use it to store the values of a style that is in their style library. That's what a design token is actually. Now, let me explain this further by telling you how it works. So, this is it. When the UI UX design team is about to send their style library to the engineering team, the UI UX designers will create design tokens and use the design tokens to store the values of the styles in their style library. Now, it is these design tokens that now store the values of the styles in the style library that the UI UX designers will send to the engineering team. Now, I would like us to see how to create a design token and see how to use the design token to store the value of a style. Let's do that. So what I have here is a design project, and in this design project, I have a style library here that contains these text styles, these color styles, these shadow effect styles, and this grid style. Now, if I want to hand over all these designs to the engineering team for them to build, it means that I will have to hand over the style library to the engineering team also. Now, the question is, how do I send all these styles here and their values to the engineering team using a design token? Remember, we are trying to see how to send our styles and their values to the engineers using a design token. So how do we do that? First things first, I will create the design token, and I will do that here in Figma using a plugin called Figma Tokens. This is it here. Go ahead, install the plugin, then come here in your design file and launch the plugin. When you get here, just click on Get Started. Now, the next question to ask is this: how do we use this plugin to create a design token? Okay, before we do that, remember that tokens are created to store the values of a style. So the question you'd ask yourself is, which style do you want to create a token for? In my case here, I will like us to see how to create a token that will store the value of this headline 1 text style over here. Let's do that. Now, since the headline 1 text style is a typography style, I will come here in front of typography here, and I would click on this plus sign here. When I do that, I would have this page show up like this. Now, over here in this field, I will enter the name that I would love to give to this token that will be used to store the values of this headline 1 text style. I would call this headline 1 token. Take note, there is no space in between the words. It's just headline 1 token. The next thing to do is to pass in the values of the headline 1 text style, because remember, we are creating the token to use it to store the values of the headline 1 text style. So to see the values of this headline 1 text style, I would come here, I would click on Edit Style here, and these are all the values. So the font family field here is where I would enter the font family value for the headline 1 text style. And over here, it is set to Rubik. So I would come here, I would take this out. I would type in Rubik. And the font weight field here is where I would enter the font weight value for this headline 1 text style. Over here, it is set to regular. So this is correct. I would leave it set to regular. Now for the line height field here, this is the field where I would enter the line height value for the headline 1 text style. Over here, the line height value is set to auto. So I'll leave it set to auto here. Now the next field here is the font size field, and over here it is set to 35. So I would come here, I would say 35 px. And the next field here is the letter spacing field. This is the field where you'd enter the letter spacing value for the headline 1 text style. So over here, the letter spacing value is set to 0.25. So I would come here, I would take this out, I would say 0.25 px, and that's okay. Now for the paragraph spacing field here, the value for this is set to 0 here. The text decoration value here is set to none, and in our own headline 1 text style, the text decoration value, as you can see here, is set to none. So I'll leave it set to none. Now for the text case value here, the text case value here is automatically set to none. Now if we come here in our headline 1 text style settings, you would see that the case value here is set to as typed. So I would come in here, I would type in as typed. Now the description field here is where you would pass in a guide or a documentation on how this headline 1 text style should be used. Now take note, this description field here is where you communicate to the engineers. Remember, this token is being created so that we can send it to the engineers for them to access all of these values that we have here. Now, this description field is where you can pass in any message that you want to communicate to the engineers. So I can come here and say, use this headline 1 text for the banner title and use it for the footer logo brand. Whatever you want to pass there is okay. Now, when you are done typing in your description, the next thing to do is to come here and click on create. When you click on create, the headline 1 token will be created, and this is mine here. Now, as you can see, when I hover on this headline 1 token, I have all the values of the headline 1 text style show up just like this. Now, this is us creating a design token and using the design token to store the values of a style in our style library. Now, the next question to ask is this. After creating the token and using the token to store the values of a style in your style library, how do you send this token to the software engineering team? It's simple. The most reliable way to do this is to come here, click on JSON here. When you click on JSON, you'd see a JSON code here that is for this token that you created. As you can see, the name of the token here is headline 1 token. If I click on JSON, you would see that the name of this JSON object here is headline 1 token. Now, this object has the property field and the value field of the headline 1 text style. As you can see here, the font family property is set to a value of rubric. The font weight property is set to a value of regular. The line height property is set to a value of auto. The font size property has its own value down to the text case property. And after that, we have the description field here that has the value that I entered. And it says, use this headline 1 text for the banner title and use it for the footer logo brand. That's it. So to send this JSON code to the software engineers, what you do is you'd come here, you'd click on sync. When you click on sync, you would come here, click on GitHub. When you click on GitHub, you'd add your GitHub credentials and then push this JSON code to a GitHub repository. When the code gets there, the software engineering team will then clone this JSON code and use the values in the JSON code to build the user interface of the application. Now, in this course, I won't show you how to connect this to a GitHub repository. If you want me to make a video for that, say it in the comment section and I would find time to create that. So we have seen how to create a design token, use the design token to store the value of a style, and we have seen how possible it is to send the design token to the software engineers without violating agile standards. Now, the next thing I would like for us to talk about is the importance of using design tokens. We need to know why it is important. So using design tokens in your design process is important because of the following. Number one, the design team and the engineering team gets to work with a type of data that can work in design and can work in code. As you can see, this headline 1 token is created here in design. This JSON code is generated here in design. And if I send this JSON code to the engineering team will work with it in code. Now, the number 2 reason why using design tokens is important in your design process is the fact that it makes the process of updates and maintenance between the engineering team and the design team easy. Now, let's say I sent this JSON code that belongs to this design token to the engineering team, yeah? And during the engineering process, the engineers are not comfortable with the font size of this headline 1 text style being 35. As you can see, this is 35. Now, let's say the engineers are not comfortable with this size, yeah? Now, we know that if the engineering team is not comfortable with a design decision like this, the engineering team won't change the design decision at engineering. What they would do is they would reach out to the design team with their concerns. Now, if the engineering team reaches out to the design team and we, the design team, decide to change the font size to let's say 24px, right? What I would do is this. I would come here first. I would edit the headline 1 text style in the style library. I would come here and I would change the font size to 24. When I change it to 24 here, I would come here to the design token that I created to store the value of this headline 1 text style. I would right click on the design token here, then I would select edit token. When I select edit token, I would come here and I would update the font size from 35px to 24px. When I do that, I would scroll down and I would click on update. Now, when I'm done with the update, I would come here in the JSON tab and I would confirm that the update is reflected. And as you can see here, the value to the font size property here has been updated to 24px, which means our update is successful. Now, when I confirm that the update has been reflected, I will then push this JSON code back to that GitHub repository. And the engineers will get the update when they pull the code from the GitHub repository. So you can see that this method is better than just sending PDF files that contains your style guide to the engineers. Using the PDF method is not smart work because let's say you have 20 updates a day. Will you send 20 PDF documents a day to the engineering team? Of course, that's going to be overwhelming. This is the reason why design tokens are important in your design process. With design tokens, you get to keep the design in code and keep the code in design. So now that we know what design tokens are, it is time to move ahead to the next item on our agenda, which is to know what material design tokens are. So let's talk about material design tokens. So material design tokens are design tokens that are created and maintained by the material design team. And so far, we know that design tokens are created and used to store the values of styles in a style library, right? Now, the question to ask is, what are the values and what are the styles that the material design team are storing in these material design tokens that they have created? To answer this question, you need to remind yourself that material design is a UI/UX design language, which also means that material design is a set of UI/UX design guidelines and principles. Now, these UI/UX design guidelines and principles that are put together to make material design a UI/UX design language were used by the material design team to build a style library and a component library. Now, the values of the styles in this style library that was created by the material design team is what is stored in the design tokens created by the material design team. So in a nutshell, material design tokens are design tokens created by the material design team to store the values of styles in the style library created by the material design team. And that's that. So now that we understand what material design tokens are, let's go over to Material Design version 3. Go to your browser, type in m3.material.io. Now, let us learn about the types of material design tokens that exist. So to do that, I would come here on the left side. I would click on design tokens here. When I do that, I would come here and I would click on how to read tokens over here. When I do that, I would scroll down to this section that says types of tokens. So as you can see here, there are 3 types of material design tokens, which are reference tokens, system tokens, and component tokens. Now, at the time of recording this video, Material Design has only released reference tokens and system tokens. So those are the 2 types of material design tokens that we are going to focus on in this course. So let's do that. The question to ask at this stage is this: what makes a material design reference token different from a material design system token? The answer to that question is: a material design reference token stores the values of reference styles in the style library, and a material design system token stores the values of system styles in the style library. Now, if you are hearing about reference styles and system styles for the first time, don't worry about it. We are going to look at that in a bit. So at this point, the next thing I would like for us to do is to learn how to identify a material design reference token when we see one, and also learn how to identify a material design system token when we see one. To do that, I would go over to Figma. Now, wherever you see a design token name in material design that starts with md.ref, know that that token is a reference token. And wherever you see a design token name in material design that starts with md.sys, know that that token is a system token. Now, MD here stands for material design, and REF here stands for reference. And over here, MD still stands for material design, and SYS here stands for system. So this is how to identify a material design reference token or a material design system token wherever you see any of them. So at this stage, I would like for us to understand what reference styles are and what system styles are, because as we know by now, it is the values of reference styles that are stored in material design reference tokens, and it is the values of system styles that are stored in material design system tokens. So to understand what a reference style and a system style is, let's use color styles to explain it. Now, let's say I want to start the designing of a mobile app project. And let's say I want to build a color system for that project, Now, the first thing to do when you want to build a color system is to have different range of colors to broaden your color options. Just like this, for example. Let's say this is our range of color options, Now, it is from these color options here that I will select a color that will play a role in my design. Now, I can just come here and I would say, okay, I would say button color. Let's say as I am building the color system, I say, okay, for the buttons on my app design, I would like this color here to be used as the color for all the buttons on my app. I would come here from these options here. I'll bring this here. So this is going to serve as my button color. Now, let's say I want to create another color rule, I would come here, I would say, background color, and let's say for the background color on the app that I am about to design, I would like this color here to be used as the background color. So it means that I have gotten a color that will play the background color role. And take note, I got it from these color options that I created. Now, I also want you to take note of something important. These colors here all have assignments. I have assigned a role to these colors here for them to play that role. But these colors here don't have any role. I just created all of these so that I can have a broad range of options to choose my app design colors from. Now, all of these colors here in this general color options section are reference color styles. And these ones here that I have selected and assigned a role to them are called system color styles. Now, it is the values of reference styles like this that are stored in material design reference tokens. And it is the values of system styles like this that are stored in material design system tokens. So let's create two material design reference tokens and use them to store the values of just these two reference color styles here. I'll just go with these two color styles for now because it's going to be repetitive and time consuming if I have to create tokens for all of these reference color styles. So let's do that. I would pull up the Figma tokens plugin and I would come here in front of colors and I would create a new token. Now over here, I would pass in the token name. And since this token is going to be a material design reference token, I would say md.ref. Now, after I declare md.ref, it has been stated or it has been declared that I want to create a material design reference token. And as we know, tokens are created to store the values of styles, right? Now, the next question to ask will be, which style do I want to create this reference token for? In my case, it is the color style. So I would say .color. Now, after specifying the style I want to create this token for, which is the color style in my case, the next question will be, what is the name of this color style that I am creating this reference token for? In my case, I would just call it reference color 1. So I would say reference color 1. Now, this here is what I am referring to as my reference color number 1. You can actually call it whatever you want to call it. You can call it reference first color, reference main color, reference brown color, whatever title you want to give it over here is okay. So this is the reference token name that I would use to create the token that will store the value of this reference color style. Now over here, I would pass in the value of that reference color style. So I would come here, keep it selected. I would come here and I would copy the color code and I would paste it in here. And I would pass in a description. I can say this is the first reference color. You can pass in whatever message you want to pass in there. And finally, I would click on create. And this token that's storing the value of this reference color style has been created. So I would go ahead and I would create another token to store the value of this other reference color style here. So I would come here, I would say md.ref.color.reference color 2. And for the value of the color here, I would come here and I would copy this and I would paste it here. And for the description field, I would say this is the second reference color. And I would click on create and that has been created. So these two reference tokens are enough for now. I would go ahead and I would create a material design system token to store the color here that has been assigned the button color role. So I would come here, I would say md.sys.color.button color. Then I would come here and I would pass in the value of that color. So I would click on this to select it and I would copy the color code here and I would pass it in here and I would say use this for buttons and I would click on create. And as you can see here, this system token that is storing the value of this button color has been created, and that's okay. Now, if I come here and I click on the JSON tab here, you'd see that I have this reference object here that contains all of the values in the reference tokens that I have created. And over here, you'd see that I have a sys object here, which is for system actually. And this object contains the values in all of the system tokens that I have created. Now, if a designer sees these tokens here, the designer will understand that these tokens here are reference tokens storing the values of reference color styles. And if an engineer sees this JSON code here, the engineer will understand that this ref object here contains the values of reference styles in it. And this system object here contains the values of system styles in it. So you can see that with tokens, we have created a common ground to serve engineers and designers. So at this point, I believe that we all understand what reference styles are and what system styles are. But if you have any questions so far, draw my attention to it and I'll be there to help. Now let's forge ahead to the next item on the agenda of this course. And the next item on the agenda of this course is to see how to create a typography system using material design. So let's see how to do that. So the next item on our agenda is to see how to create a typography system using material design. But before we do that practically in Figma, let's get to understand the details surrounding the process of creating a typography system using material design. So to create a typography system using material design, you will need to use the values of the textiles that are in the typography system of the material design style library. And just in case you are wondering what a material design style library is, just remember I mentioned earlier that the material design team created a style library with the UI UX design guidelines and principles that they put together to make material design a UI UX design language. So in that style library that they created, there is a typography system in it. And it is the values of the textiles in that typography system that we will use to build our own typography system for our own product or design system. That's that. That's the process we will follow to create a typography system using material design. So now that we know the details behind the process of creating a typography system using material design, I think it is time to start the process of creating a typography system using material design. So to do that, first thing is to go over to the material design website, m3.material.io. When you get here, come here on the left side, click on typography. When you click on typography, come here and click on applying and scaling type. Now, when you come here, you'd see that the material design team outlines 5 roles that textiles in a typography system should play on a design. Now, these roles are the display role, the headline role, the title role, the label role, and the body role. Now, what this means practically is this. The material design team is saying that when you are creating a typography system, you should create textiles in your typography system that should play the display role on your design. You should also have textiles in your typography system that should be able to play the headline role on your designs. You should also have textiles in your typography system that should be able to play the title role on your designs. And you should also have textiles in your typography system that should be able to play the label role on your designs. And finally, you should have textiles in your typography system that should be able to play body roles on your design. Now, to understand what these roles are and how textiles should be designed for the purpose of playing these roles, scroll down you'd see that there is an explanation here for the display role. So text styles that should be designed to play the display roles in your design system should appear like this, like really, really big, yeah? As you can see, it says here that display styles are reserved for short, important text or numerals. They work best on large screens. So you can come down here and read all of this documentation about these other roles. We have this documentation here for the headline role. So if you are creating a text style that should play the headline role on your design or in your design system, you should use this guideline here to create that text style. And this is an example of how text styles that are playing headline roles are used on a design. Now this here is for the title role, and you can see how text styles that play the title role on a design are used. Over here we have the label role here, and you can see that text styles that are used to play the label roles on a design are used on elements like buttons. And over here we have the body role here. Now text styles that are created to play the body role on a design are used for paragraphs or articles and all of that. So come here, read up on all of this documentation here to understand these roles better. So now that we are aware of the roles that the text styles in our typography system should be designed to play, yeah? Now the next question will be, what if I decide to create a text style that will be used to play the display role on a design? What values will I assign to such a text style? Like what font size, what font weight, what line height values will I assign to such a text style for that text style to perfectly play a display role on my design? So the answer to that question is found here in the typography tokens table. Now, it is in this typography tokens table that we have all the values that we will use to create our typography system. So the first column here in this typography tokens table is the role column. And in this role column here, you will see that each of those 5 roles that we just talked about is broken down into 3 subsets. Like the display role here is broken down into display large, display medium, and display small. The headline role is broken down into headline large, headline medium, and headline small. The title role is broken down into title large, title medium, and title small. And the label role is broken down into label large, label medium, and label small. And finally, the body role is broken down into body large, body medium, and body small. Now, having these roles broken down into 3 subsets means that when you are creating a typography system, you will create text styles that will play all these subset roles. In essence, what I am trying to say is this: when you are creating your typography system, you will create a text style that will play the display large role in your typography system. You will also create a text style that will play a display medium role in your typography system, and you will create a text style that will play the display small role in your typography system. Same for the headline large, headline medium, headline small, down to the body small role here. Now, let's start creating a typography system by creating a text style that will play the display large role in our typography system. So come here in Figma. Let's create a frame here. Let's rename the frame first to typography system. Now in this frame, I would create a text here that I would use to create the text style that will play the display large role in my typography system. So that text, I would just call that text display large, and that's okay. So I would keep this text here. So to make this text a display large text style so that it can play the display large role in our typography system, the first property that we are going to work on is the font family property of the text. Now, the question is, what value should we assign to the font family property of this text so that it can play the display large role in our typography system? Now, if you come here in the typography tokens table, you would see that there is a system token column here. And in this system token column, You would also see that each role here has 5 system tokens to itself. Now you can see that the display medium also has 5 system tokens. You can go ahead to confirm that on all of the roles that we have on this typography tokens table. Now let's look at the 5 system tokens for the display large role, which is the role we are trying to create a text style for. Now, this first system token here is storing the font value, or rather the font family value that should be assigned to a text style that will play the display large role in our typography system. So now that we know the value this system token is storing, the next question will be, how can we access the value itself to know what it is? Because so far we just know that it is storing the font value or the font family value, but we don't know the value itself. So to know that, just come here in the default value column and you'd see that the value that this system token is storing is Roboto regular. Now what this means is this. Material Design is recommending that when you want to create a text style that will play the display large role in your typography system, you should set the font value or the font family value of that text style to Roboto. But for the sake of dynamism, Material Design agrees that as a designer, you should change this font family value to any font value or any font family value of your choice. So I would come here in Figma, I would keep this selected, and in my case, I would like to use the Rubik font value or the Rubik font family value. So I would set this to Rubik. Now that's that for this first system token. So the second system token here is storing the line height value that should be assigned to a text style that will play the display large role in your typography system. And now that we know the value that this system token is storing, how can we access the value itself to know what it is? As usual, come here in the default value column and you'd see that the value that this system token is storing is 64. So this means that the Material Design team is recommending that when you want to create a text style that will play the display large role in your typography system, you should set the line height value for that text style to 64. So I would come here in Figma now, I would keep this selected and I would set the line height value here to 64. And that's okay. So let's come back to our typography tokens table. Now, just in case you are wondering how to identify the value a system token is storing, yeah? It's simple. Just take note of the last parameter in the system token name. And by the last parameter, I mean the word after the last dot in the system token name. Like you can see, this is the last dot here, right? So this word here, which is font, is used to depict the type of value that this system token is storing, and it is the font value. You can also call it the font family value. Now for this second system token here, after the last dot, we have line height. So that means that this system token here is storing the line height value that should be assigned to a text style that will play the display large role in our typography system. So let's look at the third system token of the display large role here. Now, the third system token of the display large role is storing the size value that should be assigned to a text style that will play the display large role in your typography system. And the value, as you can see over here, is set to 57, which means that the Material Design team is recommending that when you want to create a text style that will play the display large role in your typography system, you should set the size value of that text style to 57. So I would come here, I would keep this selected, and I'll change the size of that to 57 to have this. That's okay. Now, let's go back to our typography tokens table, and let's look at the fourth system token here. Now, this fourth system token here is storing the tracking value that should be assigned to a text style that will play the display large role in our typography system. And tracking actually is letter spacing. So just have that at the back of your mind. So the tracking value, as you can see here, is set to 0, which means that the Material Design team is recommending that when you want to create a text style that will play the display large role in your typography system, you should set the tracking value of that text style to 0. So I would come here, keep this selected, and as you can see here, the letter spacing value is already set to 0, so I would leave it set to 0 like that. And let's go back to our typography tokens table. Now, here in our typography tokens table, we are left with the last system token for the display large role. Now, this system token here is storing the weight value that should be assigned to a text style that will play the display large role in our typography system. And the weight value here is set to 400, which means that the material design team is recommending that when you want to create a text style that will play the display large role in your typography system, you should set the weight value of that text style to 400. Now, if I come here in Figma, you'd see that in Figma, the weight value is not set in numbers. So let's find out which of these weight options here is equal to 400. So to do that, I would come here and I would use Google for that. So I would say font weight 400. And as you can see over here, for a font weight value of 400, that font weight can also be called a normal font weight or a regular font weight. So I would come here, keep this selected, and I would set this to regular. And that's okay. So that's that. We have just created a text that can be saved as a text style and used to play the display large role in our typography system and our design system at large. Now, at this point, I would like for us to create reference display large text styles from this text style that we have created. Reason is because it is not going to be cool to limit the design team to only one type of display large text style in the design system. So what I'll do is I'll create 6 references out of this. And the property that I will tweak to have more references out of this will be the weight property. And that's the only property you should tweak. Don't tweak the size property or the letter spacing property. Just tweak the weight property. So I would create references of this. I would duplicate this. I would keep it selected and I would change this weight to medium. I would create another reference and I'll change this to semi-bold. I would create another reference here and I'll change this to bold, then create another one here and I'll change this to extra bold, then have this and set it to black. Now, it is not a must that you must have 6 references. You can have 3, you can have 4. Any number is okay. And I would like to add that apart from using the weight property to create your references, you can use other properties that are not extreme. Properties like the italic properties. You can come here and set this to light italic, just like this. And that's okay still. As long as you don't mess with the font size or the line heights value or the letter spacing value, you can actually tweak your references like this. But in this case, I won't need an italicized variant of these text styles, so I'll take these out. Now, what I have here are reference styles of the display large text style. And among all of these reference styles here, we can select any of them to play the display large role in our design or our design system. Now, if I come here, let's say among all of these references here, the design team agrees that this reference here, which has the medium weight value, should be selected to play the display large role in our design or in our design system. It means that this here is now a system style. If you remember, this is now a system style because a role has been assigned to it. But all of them here are reference styles. They are all here to broaden our design options because the app or the product can be due for update, and during updates, the design team may want to replace this system style with a different text style that will look bolder. In that case, the design team does not have to go and start creating a new display large text style. What the design team will do is go into our reference options and pick any of these ones here that can serve that purpose. So if the design team during updates now takes this out as our system style and goes with this one here, It means that this one here is now the new system style that will play the display large role in our design or our design system. Now, doing this also means that when we are creating design tokens to save the values of these text styles, the values of all of these here will be saved in reference tokens, and the values of this one here will be saved in a system token. So to make that practical, I'd like us to do that actually. I would pull up the Figma tokens plugin and I would click on get started. Now, if I want to create a token that will store any of these values here, it means I have to create a material design reference token. So I would come here in front of typography. I would create a new token. I would say md.ref.typescale. Now, type scale in material design is the full collection of material design typography styles. Now, just take note that as long as it is a textile that you are creating a material design token for, the name of that token will always be md.ref.typescale, or it's going to be md.sys.typescale before the name of the textile itself. So over here, I would say md.ref.typescale. Then I would pass in the name of the textile. In this case, I'll just say display large 1, and that's okay. Now for the font family here, if I click on it for the properties to show up here, you'd see that the font family is Rubik. The font weight for this reference is set to regular. The line height value is set to 64px. The font size value is set to 57px. The letter spacing value is set to 0. The paragraph spacing value is 0. The text decoration property is set to a value of none. The text case property is set to a value of none. I'll change this to as typed. Then for the description value, I would say use this as regular display large text. And that's it. So I would select this, come here, create a token for it, and save the values of this display large reference to the token. So I can say md.ref.typescale.display-large 2. I'd set this to Rubik, and the font weight for this is set to medium. So I would set the line height property to 64px. I would set the font size property to 57px. The letter spacing property is set to 0, and that's okay. The paragraph spacing is okay. The text decoration is okay. The text case property, I would set it to as typed. And the description field, I would pass in whatever I want to pass in. I would say use this for medium display large rows, and I would click on create, and this has been created. So to avoid me repeating the same process over and over for these remaining display large references, I'll just skip that and I would show you how to save the system style that will play the display large role in our design system. So to save this, I would come here, I would create a new token for it. I would say md.sys.typescale.display-large, and that's okay. Then I would set the font family to Rubik. This I would set to, let's select it to see the value here. It's extra bold. Now, this does not mean that in your own design system, it has to be extra bold actually. Whatever you and your design team agrees on should be what you should use here as your system style. So I would set this to extra bold, and for the line height value, I would set this to 64px. For the font size value, I would set this to 57px. The letter spacing is okay. I would come down here and I would change the text case property to as typed, and I would say use this for system styles of display large role. You can pass in whatever you want to pass in there. I would click on create. You can see we have a system typography token here, and we have our reference typography tokens here. Now, I did not spell this correctly. It's called display large here. I would edit this and I'll change this to display large. Then come here, click on update, and that's fine. So at this point, I would like you to create textiles for all of these roles here in the role column, and also create references out of all of them. And finally, create reference and system tokens to store their values in. Now, just to give you a hint, when you are creating textiles to play some roles, you may come across the fact that some of the textiles will not have a tracking value of 0. As you can see, this is set to 0.15. Now that means that you would come here in Figma and you'd set the letter spacing value here to 0.5 px. So you type in 0.5 px, then press the enter key on your keyboard, just like that. I'm just giving you a hint so that you don't get confused when you have to start typing in values for the tracking property. Now, before I go offline to create my own complete typography system, I would like to say that just in case you are wondering why I did not save these textiles to my style library, as you can see, there is no textile here in my style library. Now, just in case you are wondering why I did not save these textiles to the style library, the reason is because there is a shorter way to achieve that. And the shorter way is that after we have stored all the style values that we have created in design tokens, we will generate our style library automatically from this plugin. All I would have to do is just come here, click on create styles. Like if I click on create styles now, you'd see that over here in our style library, the textiles that we have created tokens for have been generated automatically here. If I expand MD now, you'd see that I have a ref folder here for reference styles and I have a sys folder here for system styles. If I expand the ref folder, you would see that I have the type scale folder inside of it and I have these two reference styles that I created design tokens for. If I come here now and I expand the sys folder and I expand the type scale folder inside of it, you would see that I have this system textile that I created a design token for here. So this is going to be a shorter way to achieve that. That's why you don't have to worry yourself about it. At this stage, I would pause this video, get my own typography system completed, and come back to explain a few things before we jump into the next section of this course. So I am done with creating the textiles for my typography system, and these are all of them here. These are all the textiles that I have created to play the typography roles in my typography system. But I haven't saved them to my style library yet. As you can see, there is no textile saved here in my style library. That's going to be for later. Also, another thing I have done is I have created design tokens for all of them and saved all their values in their respective design tokens. Now, before we look at the design tokens and the details of the design tokens, let's look at the details of our textiles. So this here is for the display large role in my typography system. And all of these are reference textiles for the display large role. Now, I selected the display large textile here with a regular weight to serve as the text that will play the display large role in my design system or on my designs. So all of these here are references. And this right here has been assigned a role, making it a system textile. So let's see the system token that is storing the values of this system textile, which is for the display large role. So I would come here, I would pull the Figma tokens plugin up. Then I would come here. As you can see, I have all of these typography tokens created. I would scroll down to the system section, which is this. And here we are. All of these here are system tokens that are storing the values of the selected system textiles in my design system. So for the display large, this is the system token here that is storing its values. So I would right click on it and I would click on edit token. And as you can see, this is the token name, the font family value, the font weight value, the line height value, font size value, letter spacing value, down to the description value here. So I'll just click on update to go back to this page. Now, if I scroll up to the reference section, you'd see that for the display large role, I have all of these reference tokens that are storing the values of the reference textiles that I created for the display large role. Now, over here, I have display large regular. Now, I decided to name these reference tokens based on the weight value. For example, if I am trying to store the value of this reference text style in a reference token here, I feel the best way to identify it is to say display large regular, because actually this right here has a weight value of regular. And for this, it's going to be display large medium because the weight value is set to medium. And since weight is the property that we used to create these 6 variants here for our references, I think it's just right to capture that in the naming of the reference token. So that's it. Now, if I come here, you'd see that I have a display large medium token here, and it is storing the values of this display large reference text style over here. And if you come here, you would see that I have display large semi-bold, display large bold, display large extra bold, and display large black. Now, these 6 reference tokens are storing the values of these 6 reference display large text styles. So that's the convention, or that's the pattern I used for the rest of the typography system. As you can see, that's it. So if you have any questions so far, if you are confused with any step or with any terminology, if you are confused with any concept at all, say it in the comment section and I'll be there to respond. So at this stage, this is where I am going to call it a wrap for the typography section. Now, the next thing we are going to do in this course is to move ahead into the next section of the course, which is where we are going to see how to create a color system using material design. So, to create a color system using material design is simple. All you have to do is go to the Material Design 3 homepage, come here on the left side, click on color, then select color system here. Now, when you click on color system, you would find yourself here, and that's okay. So, without wasting time, I will break down the process of creating a color system using material design. Now, the material design team recommends that the first thing you should do is to create or choose what we call key colors. Now, when you have chosen your key colors, the next thing to do is to create what we call tonal palettes. And this tonal palette that you will create will be for each of the key color that you chose or that you selected. Now, when you create tonal palettes for your key colors, the next thing you will do is to select specific colors from the tonal palettes and assign color roles to them. Let's have some space there. You assign color roles to them so that they can play or they can carry out those color roles on your design. So without talking much, I'd like us to see how this works in practice. So let's come back here in material design and let's scroll down to the key colors section here. Now, as you can see here, we are to choose or we are to select 5 key colors for our design. Now, the first key color here that we are to choose is the primary key color. The next key color here that we are to choose or we are to select for our design is the secondary key color. The next is the tertiary key color. Then we are to select a neutral key color for our design and a neutral variant key color for our design. Now, before you go ahead to choose these key colors, you need to understand the guide and the principles behind choosing these key colors for your design. So material design has a guide on how you should choose these key colors for your design. Now let's scroll down and read the guide. So over here, you can see what material design says about the primary key color. It says the primary key color is used to derive roles for key components across the user interface, such as the floating action button, prominent buttons, active state, as well as the tint of elevated surfaces. Now, in summary, just know that the primary key color will be used to generate colors for the most important elements on your design. Now, material design also states that the secondary key color is used for less prominent components on the user interface, such as filter chips, while expanding the opportunity for color expression. And material design also states that the tertiary key color is used to derive roles of contrasting accents that can be used to balance primary and secondary colors or bring heightened attention to an element. Now, the tertiary color role is left for teams to use at their discretion, and it is intended to support broader color expression in products. Now, if I scroll down to the neutral colors section, you'd see that over here, material design recommends that, or material design states that the neutral key color is used to derive roles of surface and background, as well as high emphasis text and icons. And finally, material design recommends that, or material design states that, the neutral variant key color is used to derive medium emphasis text and icons, surface variant, and component outlines. So when you want to choose or when you want to select your key colors, have all of these guide at the back of your mind. Know that the primary key color will be the most important or the most present color given to the component on your user interface. Just look at the primary key color like the color that you will use to generate the color brand or the brand identity of your design. Now, as for all of these component names here like filter chips, FABs, and the rest of them, if you are new to this and you don't know what all of those are, you can come here, scroll down, and you would see that we have all these components under the component section here. If I click on buttons, you would see that we have the FAB button component here and the extended FAB component here. You can click on them to see how they look like. You must have seen them on various designs or various applications. Now let's come back here to our key colors section. Now, just to mention, just because material design uses these color shades for these 5 key colors here does not mean that you have to use them. You are to select your colors based on the brand of what you are designing for. These colors used here by material design are here to illustrate this concept and not here for you to use them in your color system. So at this point, I would go ahead and choose my own 5 key colors. So I would come back here. I would say key colors. I would keep this here. And the first key color will be the primary key color. So I would have primary key color. So my own primary key color will be this. Now the next key color I am to choose or I am to create is my own secondary key color. So I would duplicate this and my secondary key color will be this. Now I would duplicate this and the next key color to have will be the tertiary key color. So I would have my tertiary key color here. And my tertiary key color will be this. Now, the next key color that I am to choose or I am to create for myself will be the neutral key color. So I would come here. I would say neutral key color. And my neutral key color will be this. And after that, I would have a neutral variant key color. So I would have a neutral variant key color chosen for myself. And my neutral variant key color will be this. So I have successfully chosen my 5 key colors. The next thing to do according to the material design recommendation is to create tonal palettes for each of these 5 key colors that I have chosen. So let's do that. So I'll just have this here. So before we create tonal palettes for our key colors, I think it is important for us to know what a tonal palette is so that we can have a clear understanding of what we are creating and why we are creating it. So a tonal palette for a particular color is simply having different shades or different tones for that particular color. Just like this, I would create a box here and I'll give it this color here. Now, if I want to create a tonal palette for this color here, I would have this here and I can decide to just... So this is the color that I created first. And what I have here is a tonal palette for this color. As you can see here in this tonal palette, we have different shades or different tones that you can relate with this color here. Now take note, the colors in the tonal palette of a color must be relative to the color that you are creating that tonal palette for. Like I can't have this color here and in the tonal palette I have have this. This color here cannot exist in a tonal palette that you are creating for a color like this. You can only have shades that are relative or that can be related to this color. So take note of that. So I would come here, I'll take all of these out. Now let's come back here and continue creating our color system. Now let's see how to create a tonal palette for our primary key color here. At this stage, I'd like to show you two methods that I personally use to create tonal palettes. Now to demonstrate the first method, I'll bring the primary key color here, or let's bring it up here. So let's say I have this here and I want to create a tonal palette for it. The first method that I am going to show you is to have this stay here, duplicate this, then come here. While this is open, hold down your shift key and press the up arrow key on your keyboard, just like that. Then duplicate this. Take note, duplicate this one, not this one anymore. This one is what you would now duplicate. Now when you have this here, come here, open up the color box once more, hold down your shift key again and press the up arrow key on your keyboard, just like that. Duplicate this again, come here and just keep going like that. Now you can see that this method is actually generating different shades of this color here. Now, sometimes you might decide, let's take this out. Sometimes you might decide to hit the up arrow key twice. You can just decide to hold down your shift key and press the up arrow key twice, like 1, 2. Then you have this here, go again, 1, 2. You have this here, then you go again, 1, 2, just like that. You can decide to create a tonal palette with this method. Now, the second method is this. Let's say I have this color here and I am trying to create or generate a tonal palette for it. I would bring this here, keep it selected. And what I'll do is I'll just come here and I would reduce the opacity value by 10. Currently it is 100%. I would just say 90. Then have this over here and I would say 80. Then have this and I would say 70. And I would say 60. Now, me going down by 10 is my own preference. You can decide to go down by 20. You can decide to go down by 5. Whichever value works for you is okay. I'm just trying to let you know that this can also be used in generating a tonal palette for your color. As you can see, we currently have different shades of this color here. So these are the two methods that I personally use to generate tonal palettes for my colors. But take note, you can only use one method at a time. And if you decide to use the two methods for the creation of your color system, this means that one key color will have two tonal palettes because you have decided to create your tonal palette with two methods. So one key color will have two tonal palettes. But if you decide to use just one method, then one key color will have one tonal palette. What I am trying to say is this. If I decide to use this method to generate my tonal palette, this is what I'm going to have. But if I decide to use the two methods, it means I would have this key color here and I would start generating another tonal palette for it using the second method, which is having this here, holding down my shift key and pressing the arrow key once or twice, just like this. So as you can see now, one key color has two tonal palettes that are generated with two different methods. So I would like you to tell me your favorite method for generating tonal palettes. Say it in the comment section. Now, I'll take this out and let's scroll down to this point. Now, in this course, I would like us to use just one method, which is actually going to be the first method. So to generate a tonal palette for a primary key color or any other key color here based on the material design standards, I'd like you to come back here to our color system in material design and scroll down to this point. Now, if you come here, you'd see that material design recommends that each key color should have 13 tones in their color palettes. And the first color tone should be absolute black, while the last color tone or the 13th color tone should be absolute white. As you can see over here, this first color tone here is black and this last color tone here is white. So this is how material design recommends that we create tonal palettes for our key colors. So let's do that. Now, to create a tonal palette now for our primary key color based on the material design standard, it means I would have a first color tone here, which is going to be absolute black. Now, I would create the second tone here. The second color tone will be the exact same shade as this primary key color, because at this point I am trying to start generating the tonal palette from this primary key color, which is what I have here. So I'll just keep this here like this without adjusting it at all. The third color tone will be tweaked, and I'll use our first method, which is having this up here and holding down my shift key and pressing the up arrow key. So I would press the up arrow key twice. I would go 1, 2, and I'll duplicate this 1, 2, duplicate this 1, 2, duplicate this 1, 2. I'll duplicate this and 1, 2. I'll duplicate this 1, 2. Duplicate this 1, 2. I'll duplicate this 1, 2. Now remember, material design recommends that we have 13 color tones. So far I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I still have 3 color tones to go. So I'll duplicate this, hold down my shift key, and I would press the up arrow key 1, 2. And I'll duplicate this, and I would have my shift key held down, and I would go 1, 2. And the last color tone in our tonal palette, as we all know, is going to be an absolute white color. So I'll duplicate this, keep that there, and I'll have that be an absolute white color, just like this. So we have that set. So what we have here is this. I have successfully generated a tonal palette for the primary key color that I chose. So now that I have created the tonal palette for this primary key color, it is time to label every color tone on this tonal palette based on the material design recommendation. And to understand that, if you come here, you would see that over here, material design labels every color tone on this color palette, and it is labeled as 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, down to 100. So this is how we are going to label all the color tones in our tonal palette. So I would come here, I would go 0. I would make that white so that we can see it clearly. This is going to be 10. This is going to be 20, 30, 40. This is going to be 50. This is 60. This is 70. This is 80. This is 90. Then this is 95. This is 99. Then this is 100. So for this, I would have to tweak that shade to this to make it visible. So I would select all of these labels, and I would make the size to be that and the weight to be that. And that's okay. So I would go ahead, I would pause this session, then generate tonal palettes for the rest of the key colors here. And when I come back, we are going to see how to choose role colors from our tonal palette. Now, here are the tonal palettes that I have created. So as it is now, we have chosen these key colors for our color system, and we have created tonal palettes for each of these key colors. Now, it is time for us to select specific colors from the tonal palette and assign color roles to them. So to do that, we need to ask ourselves, what are these color roles that we need to select these specific colors from our tonal palettes for? Now, to know these color roles, come here in the material design website, and let's go over to our color system, and let's scroll down to this section. Now, these are the color roles here. We have the primary color role, the on-primary color role, the primary container color role, the on-primary container color role, the secondary color role, on-secondary, secondary container, on-secondary container, the tertiary color role, on-tertiary, tertiary container, on-tertiary container color role. We also have the background color role, the on-background color role, the surface color role, the on-surface color role, the surface variant color role, the on-surface variant color role, and we have the outline color role. So what the material design team is telling us is that when you want to build a color system for your mobile app or your design project in general, you should create colors that will play these color roles on your design. And the way to come up with colors that will play these color roles is to come up with your key colors first. Then generate tonal palettes for each of the key colors that you have come up with. Now, when your tonal palettes are ready, you would go to the tonal palette and select specific colors to play these color roles as recommended by Material Design. Now, you may be asking yourself, what are these color roles and what are their functions? Now, for you to know more details about these color roles and how they should function, come here, click on color roles over here. When you do that, scroll down to this section and read the documentation about all of the color roles that we have here in Material Design. But if reading is something you don't fancy, don't worry yourself about it. As we proceed further in this course, you will learn more about the functionality of these color roles in practice. So for now, let's see how to choose or how to select the specific colors from our tonal palette that will be assigned color roles in our design system. So to do that, come here, click on key colors and tones here and scroll down to this section. Now over here, we have our first color role, which is the primary color role. Now the question is, how do we select a color from our tonal palette that will be used for the primary color role? Now let's see how to choose a color from our tonal palette that will play this primary color role. Now the way we are going to do that is like this. If you come here, you can see where my mouse cursor is on. You'd see a hint here at the bottom right corner of this box here for the primary color role. You'd see a hint here that says primary 40. So this hint here means that the color on the tonal palette of the primary key color that has a label of 40 is the color that will be selected to play the primary color role in the color system. And if I go over to Figma, you'd see that that color is this. This is it here. So I would duplicate it. I'll bring it here. I would keep that there. I would come here. I'll duplicate this. And I'll have this there. I would just say primary color. Now, if we go back to our color system, you would see that the next color role here is the on primary color role. And the way to choose a color that will play this role is to also take note of this hint here that says primary 100. This means that the color on the tonal palette of the primary key color that has a label of 100 will be selected for this role. So if I come here, you would see that that color is this color here. So I would bring this here and I would say on primary color, and that's okay. Now, if I come back here, you would see that we have a primary container color role, and we are going to use the same method to select the color that will play this role in our color system. Over here, the hint is primary 90. So I would come here. This is primary 90 here. I would select it, keep it here, and I'd say primary container. And for the primary color roles, we have the final role here, which is the on primary container color role. And here is the hint. It's primary 10. So I would come here. This is our own primary 10, or this is my own primary 10 here. I would bring this here and I would say on primary container. And that's it. So we have selected colors from the tonal palette of our primary key color that will play the 4 primary color roles recommended by Material Design. So let's see how to select colors from the tonal palette of the secondary key color that will play the secondary color roles recommended by Material Design. So for the secondary color here, the hint here is secondary 40. So if I come here and I bring this here, I can just call this secondary color, and the on secondary color role has a hint of secondary 100. So I would come here. This is the secondary 100 color here. I would keep this here, and that's going to be on secondary color. And for the secondary container color role, as you can see here, it has a hint of secondary 90. So I would come here. I'll bring this here. So I would say secondary container, And for the on secondary container color rule, the hint is secondary 10. So I would come here, I would grab this, and I'll bring it here. So this is going to serve as the on secondary container color in our color system. So I would say on secondary container, and that's okay. So far we have selected colors that will play the primary color roles in our color system, and we have selected colors that will play the secondary color roles in our color system. So at this point, I would pause this video, I would go ahead and I would create the rest of the colors that will play the remaining color roles that we have here for our tertiary key color, our neutral key color, and our neutral variant key color. You go ahead and do that also. So when I am done, I would come back, explain a few things, and we are going to proceed from there. So I am done with creating the colors for our color roles, and these are all of them here. So what we have done so far is this. We have created a color system using material design. But before we go ahead to create design tokens for the values of all these color styles that we have created, I would like to highlight some important things that you should have at the back of your mind when creating a color system. Now, the first important thing is this. The colors in the tonal palettes are reference color styles, which means that the values of all the colors in the tonal palette will be saved in material design reference tokens. Now, the second important thing to know when creating a color system is when you are picking your key colors or when you are selecting your key colors, don't pick colors with too much light. Now, what I mean is this. When you want to select or when you want to choose a key color, don't pick your key colors from this region of the color picker. And that's because colors on this region of the color picker has more light. Or you can say the colors are lighter. What you should do is to pick colors from this region of the color picker that is darker. Now, the reason I had to say this is because when you pick your key color from this darker region in your color picker, it will allow you to have enough dark shades and enough light shades when you are creating a tonal palette for that key color. And having enough dark shades and enough light shades in a tonal palette is a better color range for a design. Now, also take note that my color format here is hex. As you can see where my mouse cursor is on, it is set to hex. Now, the third important thing to know when creating a color system is that material design gives you the opportunity to have additional colors when creating your color system. And for additional colors, personally, I would say this. The two important additional colors I will advise you to add to your color system are the error color and the success color. Now, the error color will be used to display error messages on your application, and the success color will be used to display success messages on your application. Now, this is how to create an error color. It's the same process. All you have to do is create an error key color first. So I would come here, I would create an error key color, and error colors are always red. So I would come here and I would pick a shade of red. Now, after you have selected or after you have chosen an error key color, the next thing is to generate a tonal palette for the error key color. Remember, this also has to be a tonal palette with 13 color tones. So I would come here, I would use the same process. I would have the black tone first, then I would have this here. Then I'll duplicate this and I'll have this here, pull up the color picker, hold down my shift key and press the up arrow key twice. 1, 2. I'll duplicate this, come here, 1, 2, just like this. And here I have generated a tonal palette for my error key color. This is how to do it. Now I would have to label these tonal palettes. So I would come here, I would select these labels, and I'll duplicate the selection just to place it on top the tonal palette of the error key color, just like this. And that's okay. Now, if we go back to material design, you would see that when I scroll down to this point, we have a guide here. And as you can see, error 40 is the color on the tonal palette that will play the error color role. error 100 on the tonal palette will be the color that will play the on error color role. Error 90 on the tonal palette will be the color that will play the error container color role, and error 10 on the tonal palette will be the color that will play the on error container color role. So let's come back here and let's have error 40 stay here. This is going to play the error color role. I'll stretch this to this point. And the next error color role is the on error color role, which is a role that is to be played by the error 100 color on the tonal palette. So I would bring this here, stretch it to that point, and the next error color role is the error container color role, and it is a role that is to be played by the error 90 color on our tonal palette. So I would come here, that's it there, I would select it, and that's okay. And I would have the error 10 color play the role of the on error container color. So I would keep that there. Then I would have this be error color. This will be on error color. This will be error container. And this here will be on error container. And that's that. We have just added colors to play error color roles in our color system. So go ahead and create colors that will play success color roles in the design system. It's still going to be the same process. All you'd have to do is firstly come here, choose a success key color, and that's going to be green, yeah? So you can come here, you can choose this. Then when you are done choosing that, you create a tonal palette for it and use the same method that Material Design used to come up with these error color roles here. Use that same method to come up with your success color roles. Now, when you are done, I'd like you to reach out to me for comment. You can reach out to me on my Twitter handle, which is Joe_Brendan_. Reach out to me with what you have done or with any questions at all, and I'll be there to respond. Now, at this stage, I would like us to create Material Design reference tokens that we are going to use to store the values of all the colors in our tonal palettes. Remember, I mentioned that all the colors in our tonal palettes are reference color styles. And when we are done with that, I would like us to go ahead to create Material Design system tokens and use the system tokens to store the values of all the colors in our color roles section. Now, when we do that, we can then proceed to the next section of our course. So since this is going to be a long process actually, I would pause this video, get that sorted, and come back, explain a few things, and proceed to the next section of our course. And by now, I believe everyone watching knows how to create a Material Design reference token or a system token using the Figma Tokens plugin. So since everyone watching knows how to do that, go ahead and get that done. When I get mine sorted, I would come back and we are going to continue from there. So I have created reference tokens and system tokens, and I have used them to store the values of our reference color styles and our system color styles. And these here, all of these here, are all the reference tokens that are storing the values of our reference color styles. And all of these here, under the sys section here, are all the system tokens that are storing the values of our system color styles. But there is one thing that is missing, which is we don't have any of these styles saved here in our style library. As you can see over here on the right side of our Figma canvas, we don't have any style saved here in our style library. Now, how do we do that? There is a shorter way to achieve this, and I had talked about this before. So what I would do is I would come here while this Figma Tokens plugin is launched like this. I would just come here and I would click on Create Styles. When I do that, this plugin will automatically convert all of the styles that I created design tokens for, and it will save all of them in the style library of my Figma design file. Over here, these are my text styles and these are my color styles. Now, right here in the text styles section, I have the MD folder, which is the Material Design folder. When I expand it, you would see that I have the ref subfolder and the sys subfolder here. if I expand the ref subfolder, you'd see the type scale subfolder inside of it and all of my reference textiles here. These are all of my reference textiles. Now, if I collapse the reference subfolder and I expand the system subfolder of the textile, you'd see that inside the system subfolder, I have my type scale subfolder and all of my system textiles. These are all of them here. Now, for my color styles, I have the MD folder here. When I expand it, you'd see that I have the ref subfolder that will contain all of my reference color styles, and I have the system subfolder here, or the sys subfolder here, that will contain all of my system color styles. If I expand this, you'd see that I have all of my reference color styles over here. If I collapse this and I expand the sys subfolder, you would see that I have my system color styles inside of it. And that's it. Now, before we proceed to the next section of this course, I'd like to come back here in our Figma Tokens plugin, and I would click on the JSON tab here to see the JSON code for all our color and typography styles. So when I click on JSON here, you would see that we have all of these JSON objects for all of the color styles and textiles that we created design tokens for. And if I scroll down, you'd see that we have a lot of JSON objects here. All of these are for the textiles. I would scroll down to the point where we will see the JSON code for the color styles. And I think we are there now. This is it. So all of these objects here are for the color styles, and that's okay. So that's it. So at this point, I'd like us to move over to the next section of this course, which is the section where we are going to see how to create a responsive column grid system using the material design standard. So to create a responsive column grid system using material design, what you have to do is to come here in the material design website, then come over here on the left side, click on adaptive design, then select design for large screens. When you do that, scroll down to this table here, which is our breakpoint table. Now, this is how it's done, yeah? When you have a layout here in Figma, let's say you have a layout, let's click on the frame tool and let's select the iPhone 13 Pro Max layout. Now, whenever you have a layout here in Figma and you want to give that layout a responsive column grid system, what you need to do is this. You need to take note of the width value for that layout. Like you can see here, the width value for this layout is 428. Now, when you take note of the width value, you would come here in material design, and here in this breakpoint range column, you would check to see which breakpoint range that the width value of your layout falls under. Now, for this layout here, which has a width value of 428, that width value falls within this breakpoint, which is 0 to 599. Now, this breakpoint range here is actually for layout that their width value falls within the value of 0 to 599. This here is for layouts that their width value falls between the value of 600 and 839. And this here is for layouts that their width value falls between the value of 840 and above. So if you have a layout that falls within this breakpoint range, it means that that layout will have a column count of 4 and a minimum margin value of 8. Now, let's make that practical. I would come here, I would keep this selected, and I would add a layout grid property, and I would set these to columns. Then I would set the count here to 4 because that is what is specified here. Then for the margin property here, I would come here and I would set this to 8. Now take note of something here. This margin value here is actually a minimum margin value. It's not just a margin value, it's a minimum margin value, which means that you shouldn't go below 8, but you can go above 8. Now, when you are going above 8, I would advise you not to go above 16, and that's because we all know that the margin space here is to be left blank with no content in it. And this space here where we have these 4 columns is our container space, which is the space where we are going to place our designs in. And since this is a mobile layout, we all know that mobile devices are not wide enough. So it is not proper design practice to shrink the container space on a mobile device, because clearly mobile screens don't have enough space to give off. So if you go above 8, don't go above 16, but the recommended minimum margin value for a mobile device by Material Design is 8. So I'll leave that set to 8. Now the count property is set to 4. As you can see, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's okay. Now for the type property here, make sure this is set to a value of stretch, and that's because stretch is the only responsive option here. And if you have that set to stretch, it means you are good to go. Now, the gutter property here is relative. Personally, I would advise you to set this to 16, just like this. And that's okay. Now, let's keep this here and let's bring in another layout for another device type. So I would come here, I would click on the frame tool once more, and I would go to the tablet category now, and I would bring in an iPad Pro 12.9, and this is it. Now, if I want to apply a responsive column grid on this layout, how will I do it? First things first, I would come here and I would take note of the width value, and currently it is set to 1024. Now, when I take note of that, I would go over to Material Design and I would check this breakpoint column. And if you check this breakpoint column, you would see that that layout falls under this breakpoint range, which is for layouts that have a width value between the value of 840 and above. So that means that I would use all of these values here for that layout. The column count will be set to 12 and the minimum margin value will be set to 32. So I would come here, I would add a layout grid property, I would set this to column, and I would set this to 12. Keep this set to stretch still. Then for the margin property, I would set it to 32, which is our minimum margin value as recommended by Material Design. Then for the gutter property here, I would come here and I would set it to 16 still. And this is okay. Now for the margin property here, we all know that this is a minimum margin value, right? Which means we can go above 32. But I would advise you not to go above 64. Because as we know, this is an iPad device and it is not as wide as a television screen or as wide as some desktop screens. So it is not good design practice to give off so many space for your margin property. So I'd advise you not to go above 64 when you are dealing with an iPad device in this breakpoint range. And that's okay. Now let's go ahead and let's bring in another iPad layout, and that's going to be an iPad mini layout. Now the iPad mini layout has a width value of 744, and if I come here in Material Design, you'd see that that layout falls within this breakpoint range, which means that that layout will have a column count value of 12 and a minimum margin value of 12, and we all know how to do that. So I would come here, I would set this to 12, and the minimum margin value will be set to 12 with the gutter property set to 16, and always keep this set to stretch. Now the minimum margin value here being set to 12 is okay, but since it's a minimum margin value, it means you can go above 12, but I would advise you not to go above 32. That's okay. And the reason for this is because, as we know, the iPad mini device is not as wide as the iPad Pro device. So I can afford to give off more space here for my margin property than I can afford to give here on my iPad mini device. Now, let's create another layout. I would select the frame tool and I would create a layout from the desktop category. So I will go with the MacBook Pro 16-inch layout, which is this. And if you come here, you would notice that the width value is 1728. And if I come here in Material Design, you would see that that layout falls within this breakpoint, making it that that layout will have a column count value of 12 and a minimum margin value of 32. So if I come here and I set this to 12, I can come here and set this to 32, and this can be set to 24. just like that. Now for this minimum margin value here, I'd advise you to not go above 120. But take note, the minimum value is 32. Now you can pick any value between 32 and 120 that can be divisible by 4. So you can go with 64, you can go with 48, you can go with 72, you can go with any value within that range that can be divisible by 4. In my case, I would keep this set to 120, and that's okay. Don't forget to keep this set to stretch still, and that's okay. So you can see that I have used the material design guide to come up with column grid systems for my layout. Now, before I go over to the next section of this course, I'd like to let you know that when creating grid systems, it is also important to have a row grid system on your layout, because with the row grid system, you would properly place your items vertically on your layout. So if I come here now and I select this layout, I would come here and I would add another layout grid property, and I would set that to rows. Then for the count property, I would set it to 1000. You can set it to any high value of your choice. You can set it to 2000, 3000, just values that are that high. Now, when I set it to 1000, I would come here and I would change the value of this type property from stretch to center. Come here and I would change the height property here to 8. And for the gutter property, I would set it to 0. And now I have successfully set a row grid property on my layout. So this layout now has a column grid property for proper horizontal spacing and a row grid property for proper vertical spacing. Now, I just want to show you this. When you have your row grid set up like this, the most important thing you should know is this. The space between the row lines are 8px. And this is it here. That 8px is being set here in the box of this height property here. So if I change this value to 16, you would see that the space between the row lines increases. But I like to set it to 8 because that's like a base value for spacing in material design. If you come here in material design and we scroll down, you would see that there is a recommendation here by material design that says to ensure that material design layouts are visually balanced, most measurements align to 8dp, which is 8px, which corresponds to both spacing and the overall layout. Components are sized in 8dp increments, ensuring a consistent visual rhythm across each screen. So that's why I like to set the height property value for my row grid spacing to 8px. This is going to make sure that if I want to space any item on this layout vertically, I'll be doing that by 8px. So if I have this rectangle here and I have another rectangle here, I can use the row grid spacing to ascertain the vertical space or the margin space between this rectangle and this rectangle. Currently, it is 16px because I have one space and one space. I have two spaces between the both of them here. So I can say for sure that the margin value between these two rectangles is 16px. If I want to make it 8px, all I'll do is I would grab this and I would close it in, just to have one row space between these two rectangles. So you can see that the row grid spacing has enabled me to perfectly space my items vertically. And if I want to space this horizontally and I keep this here, I can ascertain, or I can be sure that the space between this rectangle and this rectangle is 16px. And that's because if I come here, you'd see that the gutter value here is set to 16, and this is the gutter in our column grid. So this space here is 16. So I can be sure that this here is 16 and this is 8. So personally, that's how I like to set the grid properties on my layout. And that row setting that I used here is the same row setting that I use on all my layouts, be it an iPad Pro layout or an iPad mini layout or a MacBook Pro layout or a desktop layout, any layout at all. I always use that same row grid setting. So that's that. If you have any questions about this section, say it in the comment section and I'll be there to respond. For now, let's move over to the next section of this course, which is the section where we are going to see how to create a shadow system or a shadow effect system using material design. Now, to do that, I'd come here, I would create a layout here, and I would just have a shape on this layout that I would use to demonstrate the shadow effect. So I would keep this here, I would give it a corner radius of 24, and I'll give it a cool color actually. So I'll just have the shapes like this. I think this is okay just to explain how it works. That's okay. Now, creating shadow effects for your designs are really important, because with the right shadow effect, your designs will look really appealing. But with a bad shadow effect, your designs will look really off and really disturbing. So it is important that we know how to create shadow effects for different purposes. And we are going to learn how to do that using material design. I would come here, I would go to material.io. Now this is material design version 2, yeah? When I get here, I would click on the search bar there and I'll type in shadow. When I type in shadow, I would come here and I would click on this link here. When I click on it, it's going to take me to Material Design version 1. Now, the reason I am using Material Design version 1 is because Material Design version 3 has not released their values yet for their elevation properties and their shadow properties. So we are going to use Material Design version 1 for now. And actually, the values here are really cool. You can use the values here to create really cool shadows. Now, when you get here, scroll down to this section that says sketch. Now, this is the section that we are going to get our shadow effect values from. Now, in this section, we have our first table, which is a 1dp elevation table. If I scroll down, you'd see that we have a 2dp elevation table, and we have up to 24 dp elevation table. Now, all of these tables contains values that you can use to create cool shadow effects. Now, let's work with one table to see how this works. So I would scroll down. I would like to work with the 16 dp elevation table, which is this. Now, on this table, you'd see that we have a key shadow column and an ambient shadow column. And right under the key shadow column, we have two types of key shadows. We have the umbra key shadow and the penumbra key shadow. Now, what we have here are values for these three different types of shadows. This opacity property here has a value of 14 for the umbra key shadow, which means that if you want to create a 16 dp elevation umbra key shadow, you'd have to set the value of the opacity property to 14. And same logic is applicable when you want to create a 16 dp elevation penumbra key shadow, and also when you want to create a 16 dp elevation ambient shadow. Now, let's go ahead and let's see how we can create our 16 dp elevation umbra key shadow. I would come here, I would use this rectangle for that. When I keep it selected, I would come here and I would add an effect property to it. Now, when you add an effect property, be sure that this here is set to drop shadow. Now, the next thing to do is to come here and click on the effect settings property icon here to have this property box show up. Now, over here, you'd see that for the 16 dp elevation umbra key shadow, the opacity property has a value of 14. So I would come here and I would set this to 14. Now, the X property has a value of 0. I would come here and I would make sure the X property has a value of 0. Now, the Y property here has a value of 16. So I would come here and I would set the value for the Y property to a value of 16. Then you would see that the blur property here has a value of 24. So I would come here and I would set this to 24. Then the spread property here has a value of 2. So I would come here and I would set this to 2. And that's that. We have just created a 16 dp elevation umbra key shadow. And this is how it looks. So I would come here, I would keep this selected, and I would use this rectangle to create a 16 dp elevation penumbra key shadow. So for the penumbra key shadow, the opacity is 12, the X property is set to 0, the Y property is set to 6. So I would come here, set this to 12, 0, and this to 6. Then the blur property is 30 and the spread property is set to 5. So I would come here, I would set this to 30 and I would set this to 5, just like that. And here we have our 16 dp elevation penumbra key shadow. Now I would go ahead to create a 16 dp elevation ambient shadow. So for the ambient shadow, the opacity property has a value of 20, the X property has a value of 0, and the Y property has a value of 8. So I would use this rectangle for that. I would set this to 20. I would keep this set to 0, and I would set this to 8. And if I come back here, you would see that the blur property is set to 10 and the spread property is set to 0. So I would keep this set to 10 and I would leave this set to 0. And here we have our 16 dp elevation ambient shadow. Now I would come here now and I would scroll down to another table. Let's say I want to use the 4dp elevation table values to create my set of 4dp elevation shadows. I would come here for the 4dp elevation umbra key shadow. The opacity property has a value of 14. So I would come here, I would use that for this. I would keep this rectangle selected and I would go with 14. For the X property, the value is 0, and for the Y, the value is 2. So I would come here, I would set this to 2. Then for the blur, it is 4, and for the spread, it is 0. I would come here, leave this set to 4 and 0, and that's okay. So what I have here is a 4dp elevation umbra key shadow. So I would like you to go ahead and create your shadows from any of these elevation tables. So since this is going to be repetitive, I'm not going to spend more time creating lots of shadow effects. Now, the next thing to do is for us to see how to create material design tokens to save the values of our grid system and our shadow effect system. So I would come here, I would pull up the Figma tokens plugin. When I do that, I would scroll down to this point and you would see that there is no provision here for us to actually pass in the values of a grid style. So what I would do is this: I would come here right in front of order, I would click on the plus sign, and for the unique name, I would say md.sys.grid. Then I would say, let's say mobile grid or whatever you want to call it. I would just say mobile grid here. Then for the description, I would say gutter is 16, and I would say column count is 4. After that, I would say margin is 8. And when I'm done passing in the description and the values for my mobile grid style, I would come here and I would click on create. And this is it right here. This is the token here. Now, this token here will be mostly useful to other designers working in the design team or working on this design system. So you'd go ahead, create more grid tokens and save the values of the other grid styles that you have in your design system. Now that's for saving the values of a grid style. Now to save the values of a shadow style, I would come here right in front of box shadow. I would click on the plus sign here. Then for the unique name, I would say md.sys. Now I am just saving the values of my shadow styles to a system token, and that's because I don't have the time now to create reference shadow styles. You can go ahead and create reference shadow styles by, let's say, coming here and creating different shadow effects from, let's say, all the elevation tables. You can create all these shadow effects from all of these tables down to the 24dp elevation table. Now when you create all of these, you can have them as your reference shadow styles, and you can select 1 or 2 or 3 of them and use them as your system shadow styles, just the same way we have been doing this so far. But for the sake of time, I'm going to save the values of all my shadow styles now to system tokens. So I would say md.sys.shadow. This is a 16dp. I would say 16dp elevation umbra. Now over here, I would specify if it's a drop shadow or an inner shadow. Currently mine is set to a drop shadow, so I would keep this set to drop shadow. Now for the X value here, the property, let's come here, the property for the X value is set to 0. Now for the Y property, the value here is set to 16, so I'll type in 16 there. The blur property has a value of 24. The spread property has a value of 2. And the color property has a value of black, which is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, yeah? Now, it's the same thing that we have here. but the color property stays at an opacity of 14%. And over here, there is no field for us to specify that. So what we are going to do is to specify that in the description field here. I would say color property has an opacity of 14%. Now, when I do that, I would come here and I would click on create. And this is the token here. Now, if any designer or any engineer comes across the values of this token, the engineer or the designer will understand how to perfectly implement your shadow effect. If I come here and I click on JSON, if I scroll down, you'd see that we have our shadow object here with all of the values for our shadow style, and that's okay. So I'd like you to go ahead and create tokens that you will use to store the values of the remaining shadow styles in your design system. And that's it. Now at this point, if we come to our style library here, you would see that we only have our text styles here and our color styles. But so far we have added grid styles and we have added shadow styles, but they are not reflecting here. So what I would do is I would still come here in my Figma tokens plugin and I would click on create styles. Now, when I click on create styles, you would see that it is just the effect styles that's been added here. And this is it here. I have only one shadow effect style here, and that's what's been added. Now, when you click on create styles, the grid style will not be added to the style library. And that's not anything to worry about. You can just come here, select all of these layouts and manually add the grid styles to your style library, just like this. You can say mobile grid, and that's okay. Now, since this is just 4 objects, it's not going to be time consuming. You can actually achieve this under 2 minutes, and that's okay. Now, at this stage, what we are going to do is this. We are going to move over to an interesting section of this course, which is where we are going to see how to design components using material design. Let's go over to that section. So before we start the designing of a component using material design, I would like for us to talk about an important design concept that you need to know about if you have to design user-friendly products. And that important design component is called component interaction state. Now, component interaction state is simply the way a component on a product behaves when a user interacts with it. As simple as that. Now, this design concept is important to understand when you are designing a product, and that's because the behavior of a component during user interaction can improve the user experience on a product. Let's take, for example, let's come over here to this website. Now, over here, you can see that we have 2 button components. The login button component at the top right corner here, and the explore all schools button component at the center here. Now, if you are asked to describe these 2 button components in a sentence, it is obvious you will say that the explore all schools button component draws more attention to itself and appears to have more life than the login button component. And we can attribute that to the fact that the explore all schools button component has a darker shade of color that appears to be more present than the shade of color on the login button component. Now, another question is, what will happen if this page is presented to users to use? Of course, it is more likely that the users will click on the Explore All Schools button component more than they will click on the Login button component. And the users will click on the Explore All Schools button component more because the Explore All Schools button component appears to be more present and actionable than the Login button component. Now, this sense of presence and life that the Explore All Schools button component gives off to the users is the component interaction state of the Explore All Schools button component. And it is the job of UI UX designers to design the component interaction state of this button component or any component at all. Now, take note of the fact that When you are designing the component interaction state of a component, you are basically designing how that component will look like and behave when a user interacts with it. Like this example that we have been looking at here, the interaction currently is a viewing interaction. Like if you come to this website and you are viewing these two button components, it means that you as a user at that particular time is interacting with these two button components by just viewing them or just looking at them. And when you are just viewing these two button components as a user, the Explore All Schools button component has been designed to have this interaction state that it has now. Same for the login button component. It has been designed to have that interaction state that it has now. Take note, this is when your mode of interaction with the button components is you viewing the button component or just looking at them. Take note of that. Now, if for example, my mode of interaction with the Explore All Schools button component changes, you will see that the state of the button component will also change. Now let me interact with it differently by hovering on it. Now I would bring my mouse here and I would hover on the Explore All Schools button component. Now you can see that the state of the button is changing when I interact with the button differently. If I move my mouse and I hover my mouse on the button, it changes its state and the appearance also changes, just like this. If I come here and I hover on the login button, you'd see that it changes its state. Now, designing this button component to change its state when I change my interaction with it is important because, as you can see, it keeps a user engaged. If a user comes to your website or to your web application and the components on the application interact with the users based on their actions with the component, the users will easily get engaged and trust the process on the application. Now, for designing your component to interact with users like this, Material Design has a guide for that. But before we see how to design components to interact with users, let's see how to create a component using Material Design. When we see how to create the component, then we can see how to add these interaction features or these interaction states to the component. Now, in this case, I would like us to see how to create a button component. So I would come here in Figma, I would pull up my Figma UI, I would take that out, and I would get set to design my button component here. So I would just come here, I would write a text here called button. Then I would go over to Material Design version 3, come here, click on buttons on the left side here. Then I would select common buttons. When I select common buttons, I would come here and I would click on specs. Now, when I click on specs, I'll be taken to this page. Now, over here, Material Design has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 types of common buttons. In this video, we are going to see how to design a field button. Now, don't worry about the other types of buttons. As long as you can understand the process it takes to design a field button, it means you will understand how to design any other type of button in Material Design. And you will also know how to design any other components in Material Design, as long as you understand this process. So this is the field button section. And we have this field button here without an icon, and we have a field button here with an icon. Now, take note of the labels here. We have label 1, 2, and we have label 3. Over here, label 1 is the container, and the container of the button is like the body of the button, the surface of the button. Then we have label 2 for the label text, which is the button text. And we have label 3, which represents the icon on this button that has an icon. So I would scroll down to the layout section, which is where we are going to see how to design a field button. So this is the layout section here. As you can see, there are some dimension specifications here on how we can go about this. So I would scroll down to this table, which is the layout values table. Now over here, the height of the button is recommended to be 40 px or 40 dp. The shape which is like the corner radius, is recommended to be 20 dp. The icon size, if you will have a button with an icon, it means the icon size will be an 18 by 18 px icon. And take note, if you are placing an icon in the component, it is not the icon vector itself that will be 18 by 18. It is the frame that the icon is sitting on that should be 18 by 18. Now, the left and right padding value is recommended here to be 24. Now, the left padding when you have an icon is recommended that it should be 16. And the right padding when you have an icon is recommended to be 24. Now, the padding between elements is only possible when you have an icon and a text on the button element. That means the space between the two elements should be 8px. Now, the label text alignment should be center aligned. Now, these are the values that we are going to use to design our button. Now, there is something missing here. We don't know what type of text to use on the button. If it's a label small text, a label large text, or a label medium text, we don't know what type of text to use here. Now, to know that, scroll up to this point. Just right after the display of the two types of field button components, you'd see that over here, for the label text property, the font family or the font value is specified to be the label large text style that you have in your style library. And remember, we created a typography system that has the label large text in it. So it is the label large text that we are going to use for creating this button component. Now, I would come here, I would keep this text selected, go to my style library, and I would look for the label large text. And this is it here. That's okay. Now, the next thing to work on is the layout or the container of the button. And for us to have that created, I would come here, I would keep this text selected, then create an auto layout on it. Now, you'd see that when I create an auto layout on this button text, the height automatically is set to 40. Now, for yours to be exactly 40, make sure that the top padding value is 10 and the bottom padding value is 10. So we have created the layout or the container for this button. So the next thing to do is to give this layout or to give this button layout a color. And what color should we give to it? Come back here. Now scroll up back to that table where we got the font value from. If you come here, you would see that over here, take note, all of this is under the field button section. Take note of that. If you come here, you would see that for the container of the field button, the color to use is specified by Material Design to be the primary color in your design system. So I'd come here, I would keep this selected, and I would go to my color style library, and I'll type in primary. And this is it here. Now, the next thing to look at is the color for the text. What color does Material Design recommend we give to our button text? If you come here, you'd see that for the label text, the color that Material Design recommends you give to the button text is the on primary color in your style library. So I would come here, I would keep the text selected, then go to my color library, and I would search for on primary color, and this is it. Now I would come back here, I would keep this button selected, and the next thing I would like to work on is the alignment of the button text on the button layout. Now, to have that sorted, let's come back here and let's scroll down to the field button layout section. Take note of that. Now, if you come here, you would see that the label text alignment is recommended to be center aligned, which means that we should set the text alignment on that button component or on that button layout to the center. So I would come here, I would keep this auto layout selected, then click on alignment and padding, and I would set the alignment of the content of this auto layout to the center. And we know that the content of the auto layout is the button text, and that's okay. Now, the next thing to look at, let's come here to this table now. We have sorted the height, right? We have sorted the label text alignment. Now, for the shape value here, this shape value is the corner radius value actually. The shape value here is recommended to be 20px or 20 dp, which means that we need to set the corner radius value of that button component to 20. So I would come here, keep it selected, come here and I'll type in 20, and that's okay. Now let's come back here to this table. The next property here is the icon size property, and since we don't have an icon on this button, I won't worry myself about that. After that, the next property here is the left and right padding property, and it is recommended by Material Design that we give that a value of 24 dp or 24 px. So I would come here, while this is still selected, I would set the left padding value to 24 and the right padding value to 24, and I have this. Now let's come back here to our table and let's be sure that everything is sorted. So this is sorted, this is sorted, this is sorted. We don't have an icon, so we won't need this. We don't have an icon, so we won't need this. We don't have an icon, so we won't need this. So what I have done is this. I have just created a field button component. So I would come here, keep this selected, and I would rename this to field button. And that's it. So the next thing I'll do is to keep it selected, come here and click on create component. Now for this button component that I have created, I would like us to design how this button component will look like based on different interaction from users. So to know how to do that, come back here in Material Design. Make sure you are in the field button section. Take note of that. Don't use the values for another type of button on a different type of button. So I would come here, I would scroll up to this section that says field button states. Now, as you can see here, it says states are visual representations used to communicate the status of a component or interactive element. So over here, Material Design outlines the interaction states for this field button component, and they are the enabled state, the disabled state, the hovered state, the focused state, and the pressed state. So let's understand what these states are actually. The enabled state here is simply how an actionable button component should look like when a user is viewing it or is looking at it. The disabled state here is how a non-actionable or a disabled button component should look like when a user is viewing it or looking at it. The hovered state is simply how a button component should look like when a user hovers on it. The focused state is simply how a button should look like when a user focuses on it. And just in case you don't know a practical example of the focus state, I would make that practical. I would pull up my notepad and I'll just write gibberish. Now, when I try to close this notepad here, you'd see it's going to ask me, do you want to save changes to untitled? Now, if I decide to select any of these options with the arrow keys on my keyboard, not with my mouse, yeah? If I use the right arrow key on my keyboard, you'd see that the don't save button looks different from how it looked when I was using my mouse. Now, this don't save button is in a focused state. That's it. And finally, the pressed state is simply how a button should look like when a user clicks on it or press it. Now, these 5 states here are the 5 interaction states recommended by Material Design for a field button component. In essence, what I am trying to say is Material Design recommends that when you are designing a field button component, you should create these 5 states or these 5 interaction states for the field button component. Now, the next question will be, how do we design a field button to have these 5 interaction states? Now, to answer that is pretty easy. Just scroll down to this table, and this table contains all the information we need for that. Now, just in case you are wondering what this section is, this is the dark mode variant of these buttons here. So this is exactly what we have here, but this is just in dark mode. So let's see how to use this table to create those 5 interaction states for our field button component. Now, the first state here is the enabled state. Now, when you want to create a field button component to be in the enabled state, you will design the container of that field button with all of these properties and values here. Now, when you want a field button to be in the enabled state, you will design the button text, which is, as you can see here, this is label text. You will design the button text with all of these properties and values that you have here. Now, when you are designing a field button that has an icon and you want it to be in the enabled state, you will come here and you will use this property and values here to design the icon on that field button. Now, same logic is applicable when you want to design a button that is in disabled state. You will use all of these values here. For hovered state, you will use all of these values here. For the focused state, you will use all of these values here. And for the pressed state, you will use all of these values here. So let's see how to use these values. So I would come here in Figma. I would keep this button selected and I would use the variant feature to achieve this here in Figma. So I would keep it selected, come here, and I would click on the plus sign in front of variants there to have a variant created. Now, this first variant is what I would use for the enabled state. So I would keep it selected, come here, and as you can see, for the container, material design recommends that the color should be our primary color. That's okay. Now, for the container, material design recommends that we give it a shadow color of our shadow style, which is actually black. And over here, we have an elevation property. Now, elevation and shadow always goes hand in hand, because when a shadow effect is evident, you will always notice that the surface of that component is somehow lifted off the ground, or you can say is somehow lifted up against other surfaces around it. Like if I come here now and I just keep this selected, for example, and I add a shadow effect, you'd see that this goes up, like the surface leaves the ground sort of. I would come here and I would take this out. So the component leaving the ground or leaving the surface is elevation. So over here, material design recommends that the elevation for the enabled button should be set to a level of 0. And if it is set to a level of 0, it means that no shadow effect will be evident. The button will not have a present shadow effect when it is in the enabled state. So this means that for the container, we are good to go for all of these settings here. Now, for the label text on the enabled state button, material design recommends that the color that should be given to the label text should be the on primary color. And if I come here and I select this text, you would see that the color that is given to it is the on primary color. That's okay. Now, for the font here, the type of font that we should use on an enabled state field button should be the label large text style that we have in our style library, and that is what we have here. Actually, this is set to label large. We are good to go for that. Now, if I come back here, you would see that all of these other properties here, like the line height property, the size property, tracking and weight property, are all embedded in the label large text style that we have in our style library. So we don't have to set that individually. Now, since we don't have an icon, we won't worry about this. So that means that we have created a field button component for the enabled state. Now, let's go ahead and let's create a field button component that is in a disabled state. I would come back here. First things first, I would like to duplicate this to have 5 of them. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'll add one here, which is 5. That's okay. Now, I would use this second variant here to design a field button that will be in the disabled state. So let's come back to this table. If you come here, you would see that for a field button that should be in the disabled state, material design recommends that the container should have a color with a value of on surface, which means that you should assign the on surface color style in your style library to that button. So I would come here, I would keep it selected, and I would go to my color library and I would search for the on surface color, which is this, and that's it there. Now, when I come here, you would see that the elevation is also set to 0, which is okay. Now, there is a property here, which is the opacity property. Material design recommends that the container of that field button in the disabled state should have an opacity value of 12%. So I would come here, keep this selected, then come here and detach this style so that I can be able to tweak the opacity property of the color here. So I would come here and I would type in 12. to make it 12%, just like this. And that's okay. Now, if I come back here, you'd see that for the label text of the field button that should be in a disabled state, Material Design recommends that we use the on surface color for that label text. So I would come here, keep the text selected, and I would go with the on surface color, just like this. Now, if I come back here, you would see that for the label text, there is still an opacity property here, which is set to 38%. This means that Material Design is telling us that when you are designing a field button component that should be in the disabled state, the label text should have an opacity of 38%. So I would come here, keep the button text selected, and I'll detach the color style so that I can change this value to 38, just like this. And this is what we have. So far I have designed for the enabled state and the disabled state. So this is how my field button component will look like on my product when it is in the enabled state. And this is how it will look like when it is in the disabled state. Now let's continue and let's design for the remaining states here. Now, if I come here, you would see that the third state is the hovered state. Now, for the hovered state, Material Design recommends that the container of the field button component that should be in the hovered state should have a state layer color of on primary. So I would come here, I would keep this selected. Since this is the variant I would use for that, I would keep it selected, come here, and I would set the color to on primary. Then I would come back here, and you'd see that there is a state layer opacity property here. And the state layer opacity property here has this token that is storing its value. Now, for us to see the value that is in this token here, I would like you to come here, right click on interaction states, and then click on open link in new tab so that you'd have this. Now come here, if you come here, scroll down to this table, you would see that we have these 4 state roles here. If I come here, you would see that for the hover state layer opacity, the value is 8%. So this means that I would come here, I would keep this variant selected, and I would detach its color style so that I can set the opacity value to 8, just like this. Now, if I come back here, you would see that there is an elevation property here with the value set to level 1. Now, I won't go into the details of the elevation property for Material Design version 3, and that's because Material Design has not released the values for the elevation property in Material Design version 3. So what I'll do is I'll just come here, keep this selected, and I would add a shadow effect style, and I'll tweak this just to give it a light elevation there. And I would say, and that's okay. Now, if I come back to this table here, you would see that for the label text of a field button that should be in a hovered state, Material Design recommends that the label text should have a color of on primary. Now, if I come here and I select this, you'd see that the color style selected here is the on primary color, which means we are good to go for that. Now, when I come back here, the next property here is the icon property. And since we don't have an icon on our field button, it means that we don't have to worry ourselves about this. So far we have created this field button in the enabled state, in the disabled state, in the hovered state. So let's come back here and let's look at the next state that we have to work on. So the next state here is the focused state. Now, Material Design recommends that when you are creating a field button that should be in the focused state, the container of that button should have a color of on primary. So I would come here, I would keep this selected because this is the variant I would use for that state. Then I would come here and I would set this to on primary. Now I would still keep this selected, come back here, and I would look at the next property here, which is the state layer opacity property. Actually, the focus state layer opacity property. So if I come here, you'd see that we have the focus state layer opacity here, and the value is 12%. So I would come here, keep this selected, I would detach the color style so that I can set this from 100% to 12% to have that. Now I would come back here and the elevation value here is set to 0. So it means that I won't have any elevation on that variant. Now for the label text on the field button that should be in focused state, material design recommends that the button should have the on primary color value. So I would come here, keep the text selected, and as you can see, the color value is set to on primary. Now, if I come here, you'd see that the next property here is for the button icon. And since we don't have any icon on our button, we are not going to be worried about this. Now, the next state here is the pressed state. So what material design is trying to say is, if you are creating a field button that should be in the pressed state, the container of that button should have the on primary color in your style library. So I would come here, I would keep this variant selected, and I would come here and I would use the on primary color for that. Then if I come back here, you would see that there is a state layer opacity here, which is the hover state layer opacity. If I come here, the hover state layer opacity has an opacity value of 8%, which means I would come here, keep this selected, I would detach the color style, and I would set this to 8%. Now, if I come back here, you'd see that the elevation value is set to 0, which means that variant won't have an elevation property. Now, if I come here, you would see that the label text on the field button that is in pressed state is recommended to have the on primary color in your style library. So I would come here, I would keep this selected, and as you can see, this is assigned the on primary color. So for this variant, I might decide to just give it a little shadow effect, just like this, and that's okay. So the next thing I'll do to make sure that these buttons are identified by their states is to keep this component itself selected. Come here, and I would set the variant property. I would set this to state. Then for this, I would set the value of the state to enabled. For this, I would set it to disabled. For this, I would set it to hovered. For this, I would set it to, let's see what we have there. I would set it to focused. And for this, I would set it to pressed. So if I go to my assets panel now and I grab the button component into my design, you would see that I'll be able to set my field button component based on its states. I can come here and select the hovered variant, the disabled variant, the pressed variant, or the focused variant. Any of them will be okay for me, just like that. So this is how to use this table here to create different states of your button component. And this table is not just for the field button component. Every other type of button component has the state table also. Like for the field tonal button component, this right here is the state table for it. And it is the same method that I have been using that you will use if you want to create these 5 states for a field tonal button component. It's still the same method. So always come here in material design and use the current values that material design specifies on all of these tables. So this is where we are going to call it a wrap for this course. So if you have any questions, say it in the comment section and I'll be there to respond.